In this second part of the two-part interview, Charles Hall details what he knows about the tall blonde aliens, learned from his 2.5-year stint as a weather observer specialist at the Gunnery Ranges at Indian Springs, within the perimeters of Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. His story is fascinating due to the detailed descriptions of numerous experiences described. For anyone wanting to dig deeper, I highly recommend reading his 5-book series, Millennial Hospitality. It is a fantastic read. Charles's account is without doubt the richest insight available into the alien race at Dreamland, and while he doesn't have a full picture or understanding, because he was never debriefed about the relationship, their nature, purpose, or objective, only that they were there and he was to interact with them. Regardless, Charles offers the clearest collection of experiences available anywhere, and they are consistent with accounts of remote viewers and government whistleblowers on the topic of Dreamland and Areas 51 through 54. As an example of this is the account of a family losing their child in the thick of the desert, and Charles was credited with helping them find it. He also helped a wounded guide get medical help, and for these acts, Charles became revered by the blonde aliens and trusted. And while he was never allowed to get close to their children or touch them, parents would bring their children to Charles to observe his launching of weather balloons, traveling colorfully through the air as a form of entertainment. He retells hundreds of such interactions with the tall blonde aliens as he chronicles his experiences while on continual duty. You're left with the account of a fearless man, unscathed by the repeated night visitations of aliens into his observation quarters at night, alone, feeling sheer terror, yet never lashing out to defend himself. Rather, he chose to interact and communicate. As a result, he learned they are individuals with different temperaments and emotions, and like us, they revere their families, including their extended families. And they have military generals, scientists, tech experts, and yes, they also have tourists visiting Earth and observing humans like gorillas at the zoo. Untrained, they can be as afraid of us as we are of them. This never bothered Charles, which is why he lasted for as long as he did, interacting with tall blondes and little by little learning who they are and now sharing it with us. Let's listen to Charles J. Hall.
The scout craft was made completely out of American parts and looked like an RV trailer. When you went on board, it was ellipsoidal, and the scout craft was white with windows on both sides, and more windows. The door, when you looked at the front of it, when you were standing looking at the front of the scout craft, the door was on that craft was on the right. Since they were all made here, there was a number of different variations in the design, and the windows on that side extended further back than on the left side. There were no windows on the back, none on the top, none on the bottom, and only one door, the one on the right, which opened from the top, and much like a Learjet, or some Learjets. When you went on board, there was a bulkhead about a third of the way back. In front of the bulkhead on all the scout craft, the design was the same. There were 5 seats without seat belts that you just sat in. The tall whites are not built strong like we are, so the idea of belting themselves in would damage their bodies. There was 2 seats for the pilot and the co-pilot, and then 3 other seats in the front. And they weren't very interested in showing me the cockpit area. They said there wasn't much about it that I would understand anyway. On the bulkhead, there was a set of panels. Nowadays, we consider it old hat, switches that don't move like you have in microwave ovens. But in the 60s, that was considered pretty avant-garde, even though I realized that the first motionless switch was actually copyrighted in more or less about 1929, but they weren't in common use. On each switch, there were a set of icons. Now we consider that old hat too, because you buy your car and there's icons. But in the 60s, that was considered pretty avant-garde. The icons were pretty ordinary. One controlled the outside lights, and it looked like the sun. one controlled the inside lights. And so in terms of the icons, there wasn't, or the hieroglyphs on the switches, they weren't very different than, say, hieroglyphs on the Egyptian pyramids or the icons that you see on a modern-day automobile. Behind the bulkhead, there were at least 3 or 4 different designs depending on which model of the scout craft you were looking at. In the RV model, the one that on that day that I was on, what was behind the bulkhead was an ordinary RV. When you went in there and you were looking towards the back, on the right there was a microwave oven, only where the aliens had taken off the mechanical door and put on a different cover with coils around it. And then when they turned on the oven, they first turned on the coils, and the coils put out the standard field and prevented the microwaves from going through that field into the room beyond. So it looked like a little cave where you'd turn it on and then turn it off, and you didn't have to fiddle with the door, you see. In the back was the latrine, just like in an RV. And the left, they had the seats where you would eat, but also they had hammocks where the children would sleep. And then they had the overhead compartments and a few storage things in the back, although not a great many of them. And then on the bulkhead in the front, they had a mirror and a makeup table where the teacher would put on her stuff. And it was all pretty ordinary. And that was the RV model. My website is millennialhospitality.net, where I have additional information related to my books and the Millennial Hospitality series. The number of tall white aliens at the base varied somewhat depending on how many deep spacecraft were in port. However, as I describe in Book 3, in the chapter entitled The End of Innocence, on one night I saw between 200 and 300 different tall white individuals. There were so many I couldn't count them, lined up along the mountains to the east up along where the ammunition bunker was. On the night that the tall white lady known as Pamela was supposed to finish her final exam to be head of the technology transfer team to go into Livermore. On that night, as I describe in my book, she panicked and failed. But in amongst those 200 or 300 tall whites, and that's just an estimate because I couldn't. It was a crowd of people, and I couldn't count them all. There were also American Air Force personnel, nobody below the rank of colonel. There was like a 4-star general, a 3-star general. There were several of them. There were also several American government people in civilian clothing over there. The tall white individuals that they were talking to appeared to come from all walks of life. Some of the tall whites were clearly the tall white equivalent of generals. Others were clearly the equivalent of tall white civilian government people. But there were an awful lot of tall whites who weren't obviously part of the military, but were just women and children. At one point, for example, the tall white lady whose CIA name was the teacher was standing out in front of the line with a group of children around her and was pointing out the position of the balloon that I had released and where it was in the sky for them to all watch the balloon floating. And so the tall whites had a social structure, a division of labor, very similar to our own. And so some were military people, some were medical people, and they had personalities accordingly. On that night, I counted between 35 and 50, perhaps as many as 75 scout craft that had parked in the part of the desert that I had dubbed the parking area. There were so many I lost count of the numbers. I couldn't count them all. But I estimated that somewhere between 35 and 50 was a reasonable count, but there may have been 75. So the number of tall white individuals and scout craft, was at least that large. I have no idea if that was everybody on the base that had come down or what percentage that was, but the number of people that you could see, the number of individuals that you could come across was at least in that numeric range. The number, when they came around to where I was, they came around, the kinds of individuals that came around were from all walks of life. And the tall white doctor came around and the tall whites he brought with him appeared to be medical students. They had no interest in the mechanical aspects of what I was doing, although the doctor, like a human doctor, he cared only about the humanistic aspects. On the other hand, on a different night, one of the tall white guards brought around three young adult tall white men who were clearly electrical engineers. One of the tall white individuals that I was reasonably good friends with called himself co-pilot, but he was very proud of his ability to repair the scout craft, and he wanted to have been called the mechanic, but I guess the name was taken, and so he had to pick a different name, And another one was called the captain. He didn't appear to understand humans very well, and he didn't appear to want to. He appeared to just want to come and do whatever he had to do, and then, if whatever you were for humans, well, that was you, and go on about his business. Whereas the doctor, described in The Wayward Wind, he wanted to come and really understand humans. What are they like, you see? Others, like the tall white general that I previously referred to, the idea of him understanding anybody, that he didn't care to understand anybody, he came to give the orders, and you were there to take them, And if you liked him, fine. If you didn't like him, fine. But he was the general. They were all like that. The teacher was there and with the guards, and the children were playing on the steps of the control tower. And I walked over close to her, 10 feet or so, and on that night, she was willing to answer a few questions. And I asked what she thought of humans and the planet Earth. I asked her how it compared with other inhabited planets that they had seen. And she said that they considered the Earth to be a cold, desolate wilderness. On the other hand, she said the thing that they found unique about humans is our willingness to do things with animals. Her example was that I grew up in a farm in Wisconsin. I feel very comfortable milking cows, riding horses, making pets with dogs. Yet each of those animals could kill me if they wanted to. I don't think of it that way because instead, like all humans, I first try to decide how the animal is thinking, and then I approach the animal accordingly. So I calm down the horse by speaking to it nicely and approaching it from the front. I put the cow in a stanchion and calm it down and begin milking. I make friends with the dog by feeding it and patting it on its head. She said that they considered that to be very unusual. She said that on most inhabited planets, once a group of intelligent people evolved, they had no interest in dealing with the less intelligent animals and usually just killed them all off. They had no intent. That she pointed out that I felt comfortable with pets of cows, making pets of dogs, making pets of. She referred to the time a few days earlier that I'd been down playing with some of the dogs that really weren't my dogs, but from people that lived in the housing area, feeding them and teaching them to roll over and sit up. She said usually the intelligent people just, don't care what the dog thinks, just shoots them, And they found humans to be very unusual in that regard. And the way she described it is because we were willing, even though we were intelligent, we were willing to try to think like less intelligent animals. Okay. They always came armed. Now the children weren't armed, and the adults that were very old typically weren't armed. But the young adults and the adults that weren't too fragile, they always came armed. Their weapons typically appeared to be look like white pencils with a certain squarish cross section. The young adults typically carried weapons that were perhaps 6 inches long, The older adults typically carried weapons that were longer, presumably with greater power. The weapon worked like a microwave laser. The weapon could be adjusted for frequencies appropriate for different elements. If they adjusted it for the frequency of sodium, for example, in the human nerves there are sodium atoms and calcium atoms. And if they adjusted it for sodium and fired it at you, it would make it seem like you were getting an electric shock. Like, depending on the power of the weapon, it would feel like you just touched a high voltage wire of 100,000 volts and was extremely painful. If they set it high enough, they could kill you by just going zappo and you'd be electrocuted. If they had it set low, then it would just give a tingling affair. They never actually used the sodium setting on me, but I did meet, for example, a CIA guard who said that one day he had been walking with the teacher coming down the steps of the Capitol building. And because their bone structure is slightly different than ours, he wasn't familiar with the way they look when they're walking down steps. And he said they were partway down, and it looked to him like the teacher was going to fall. And so without thinking, he reached out and grabbed her by the elbow to steady her. And he said she almost killed him. She jerked the weapon, set it to the sodium setting, and had him down on his knees saying, "You think we're fools? You think we're idiots? You think I'd come here if I couldn't take care of myself?" And she said, it was all he could do to breathe when she used that weapon on him. And he was absolutely terrified of her. She put him through 5 or 10 minutes of who's giving the orders and who's taking them, and it was nothing but yes ma'am, no ma'am, and they never did that to me. Although in addition to the guard, I met a number of guys they had done that to. Another set, if they moved it to the calcium setting, then it was like putting you to sleep or calming you down. So like if you were standing there and they did it to you, you might not be able to move your feet, but you wouldn't actually feel terrified. They didn't use the calcium setting very often. One of the weapons they could set to hypnotize a person. When they used that setting, they typically liked a clean shot at one of your temples. And what it would do is induce the same as if you were hypnotized. They could turn it on instantaneously and turn it off instantaneously. And it was common to have missing time experiences. One day I was walking from my theodolite stand to the weather shack. It happened a large number of times, but on this day in particular. And it was like 19 or 20 steps from the theodolite stand to my weather shack. And I could clearly remember taking step 12. And I could clearly remember finishing step 14. But in between those two steps, almost 20 minutes went by. It used to annoy me greatly until I'd finally gotten to where I could break through that hypnotism by relaxing and letting your mind wander. And what had happened was, it was one of the early days in '65. Range 4 Harry had brought some new arrivals around, and he had stepped out from the alleyway between my weather shack and the supply shed and had a clean shot at my right temple and hypnotized me as I was taking step 13. And then while I stood there, he'd brought out the new arrivals and said, "This is Charlie. See, he's got teeth. Open your mouth, Charlie." Just like you do when you're hypnotized. And said he eats more times than we do. And, giving him the tour, this is what a human is. And then when they all went back in, then he's, it took him about 20 minutes to go through his introducing them to a human routine and released it and then went on, Because of a number of episodes like that, I used to have a policy of writing the time down when I did things. So I used to have a policy of writing down the time, and before I started walking back to my weather shack, of writing down on my weather report, when I left the theodolite stand, and then writing down on my weather report when I got to my weather shack. And of course, it should only be like a minute or two, you see, and just to see if they'd done that to me, and I didn't remember it because they could do it so quickly. I'll say one more thing about the weapons. They had another setting that I know about, the iodine setting. And if they fired you, if they hit you with the iodine setting, especially in the thyroid area, it would affect the iodine in your blood, and it would alter the chemistry of the blood so that your blood would seep through the arteries, and you'd bleed to death in like 2 minutes. Um, Now, nothing I did was ever classified. Nobody ever gave me a briefing before I went out there. Nobody ever gave me a briefing when I came back. My orders said that nothing I did was ever classified. I was never part of a project. We were never building like airplanes or missiles, so therefore I was never shown any classified drawings or anything like that. Everything I know I had to figure out for myself. There's a good reason for that. The aliens don't handle anger the way humans do. When they become angry, they either go away or they kill you, or humans, we get angry with each other and we fight and then we become good friends. The aliens, at least where humans are concerned, or at least my experiences, aren't like that. They're either pleasant or you're in trouble. If I didn't bring anything off the ranges, I didn't bring any photographs, any documents, any material. I came off only with my memories. There was nothing to debrief me on. The alien mothers, remember, are very proud of their ability to raise their children. If anything I did was classified, that would mean, for example, that after the teacher brought her daughter and her daughter's playmates around to simply play, then I would have had to have been called in and be debriefed by CIA guards. That would have upset the teacher beyond limit. To have 2 ordinary human guards call me in and start asking questions. How does the teacher take care of her children? Do you think she's doing a good job? Do you think? I mean, you wouldn't have had to tell her. The next time I went out there, using their communication equipment, she would have just said, she would have just figured it right out. Or the next time the generals showed up, she'd have just figured it right out. Well, remember the experience of that CIA guard on the steps of that he related to me on the steps of the Capitol building. The idea of upsetting the teacher, I mean, she was perfectly willing to just jerk the weapon and say, who's giving the orders? I thought we had an agreement, The committee had agreed, which included the teacher, Range 4 Harry, some of the other tall whites, as well as the American generals. They had agreed that nothing I did would ever be classified, and the tall whites expect their agreements to be carried out, just like Philadelphia lawyers, to the letter. They go through a lot of trouble. They are very conscious of their agreements, and they keep them to the letter. And they expect the same from humans. 40 years isn't much time for the tall whites, since they live so much longer than we do. If anything I did was classified, they agreed that nothing I did would ever be classified. They meant that period, and they meant the American generals to keep that period, And after all, I don't have any drawings or pictures. I didn't, the log books that were out there, I left out there. There were, usually classification refers to material things, drawings, material, whatever. When I was out there, I never observed the aliens to do anything magical. They were very good at building craft that traveled faster than the speed of light. They did not travel in time. I never observed them traveling to another dimension. I never saw, they're not angels, they're just creatures like us. I'm very religious, I'm Roman Catholic, that angels are angels and aliens are aliens. They did not come to teach me anything. They came for their purposes. They didn't. Currently, it seems to me that American physics is kind of in the reverse Galileo position. In the time of Galileo, religious leaders required that scientists think inside the box, and scientists like Galileo wanted to experiment and think outside the box. Now, however, the situation appears to be reversed. American physicists seem to think that Einstein was always and forever perfect and complete, and so American scientists keep thinking inside the box. In Hall photon theory, my belief is that inside the photon there is a third field, but currently the box says there's only two fields. Most scientists won't consider it. They're insisting on thinking inside the box for religious reasons, pretending it's science, you see. As I describe in the appendix of Book 3, I show in a scientific manner how scientists should be approaching that. Currently, it's the religious leaders who are willing to consider guys like Monsignor Balducci, I believe, and so on, who are willing to think outside the box and say, of course, there can be intelligent life on other planets. One of the biggest shocks that I had to overcome in 1965 and 66 was once I realized that they were real, they were here, and that Einstein was wrong, and that God created life on many, similar to us, on a whole bunch of different planets. It was the shock of realizing that so many people had been so wrong for so long, you know? I mean, once you saw their craft come in defeated, floating on the gravity field in perfect silence and landing, it was the shock of saying, how could so many American scientists not have discovered that, or not even be trying to discover it, not even be thinking about that? And likewise, from a religious point of view, it seems the teacher herself, one time on a different night when I went over there and I was talking to her, and she was willing to answer a few questions. She was teasing me because they have a dry sense of humor, and they liked to outthink me, and they could do so very quickly or very easily. And she said, and I was saying. She was making a long story short. She was pointing up to the stars in the sky, and she said, "You can see all the stars in the sky. Surely you didn't think you were alone." And at the time, I had, you know. And then they're all laughing, you know. Surely you didn't think that whatever life was on the Earth wouldn't be repeated on the other stars, you know. And I had, and then they were all laughing. Boy, is he silly, you know. And it just seems so obvious to me when you go out at night and you look up at the stars of the sky, that whatever God did to make life here on Earth, he must have done it again, because there are so many stars in the universe and it's so vast. And religious leaders are willing to think outside the box. Whereas now when I go and I talk to the scientists and stuff, they all start with this box called Einstein. Einstein himself never claimed to be perfect and complete, but all of his followers seem to claim that he was perfect and complete. And I think that's one of my observations is that box they're in. Well, remember when the teacher said that on other planets the intelligent beings typically killed off the animals, she was referring to other planets they'd seen with intelligent life on them, but she didn't elaborate. And the reason is because when they came for their purposes. They didn't come to say, "Let me tell Charlie everything there is to know about the universe." They didn't care. If they didn't have anything to say, some nights they might just come, not say anything. The kids might play and they might leave, you know. Especially the men. If there was no reason for them to actually come and talk, when they were close, like that night when there were the 3 electrical engineers there. They wanted to see me start up the electrical generator because that's the same kind of power source the U.S. Air Force had given them for use up on their hangar, because it was built by the Air Force. And they wanted to see how I used it as part of their training program, see? Well, from their point of view, there's no reason to talk to me about it. They just want to see me do it. So they came and just stood there and watched. And then, you know, eventually Charlie's bright enough to figure out that I should just carry on with my duties, and they would just stand and watch. And then, you know, if there had been a reason for them to say, "What does this do?" then they would have said, "What does that do?" But they didn't come and say, "Oh, let me tell you about this star, or let me tell you about that star," or anything like that. One of the things I had to do is put aside the baggage of Hollywood. We all know how Hollywood thinks things are supposed to go. According to Hollywood, when aliens come, there's supposed to be lights in the sky, and they're supposed to be pretty colored and move fast and have clever formations, and then they're supposed to land over there, and somebody's supposed to come out and do weird things. I really wasn't ready in the 60s for the idea that I would just walk around the corner of one of my weather shack and there would be a man standing there. The day I did at Range 1, and he wasn't human, and he was just standing there looking at me, and what he was doing is guarding the play area where the teacher and the children were playing. And you hadn't seen the craft, you hadn't seen the scout craft, you hadn't seen him come, you hadn't seen him leave. There was no reason for him to say anything because there's no reason for you to know what he's doing there. He's just guarding the entrance where the kids and the teacher are playing on that day. And if you feel like standing there and looking at him, well, that's fine with him. If you feel like running away, that's fine with him, because he's not human. He sees it differently, and it took me he's not human. He sees it differently, and it took me a while. It took me a very long time, several weeks, to get used to the idea that they are the way they are that way because they like themselves being that way, and that's different than the way Hollywood would have us think they were. And of course, one of the biggest shocks is they were so similar to us in so many ways. They love their children, they have a dry sense of humor, they love to tell jokes and laugh, and they get bored out of their gourd up in the base. One of the common things to talk about with the young, tall white women was fashions. The Air Force provided them with clothes straight out of the Sears catalog. One of the jokes the teacher used to make about the Air Force generals is up on their base, in their commissary, there were some clothes that the generals had picked that they could choose from. And of course, the teacher used to say, well, all the American generals are all old men, so naturally they have no fashion sense, right? And she used to laugh about the fashions that the generals thought they should wear, you see. And one of the things that she and the other young, tall white women wanted to do was to go into town and buy pretty clothes. And of course, we don't think of aliens that way, but when in my weather shack, I used to have a Sears catalog, a Montgomery Ward's catalog, a J.P. Penney's catalog. We had outdoor plumbing, and so I had several copies of the catalogs for several reasons. And one of the things that the young, tall white women used to like to do is to come through and look through my catalogs. And what they'd be looking at are women's clothes. Sometimes when you'd see them out in the desert, or especially on the morning, what they'd be wearing were clearly clothes straight out of the Sears catalog or the Montgomery Ward's catalog, and they were very, they were as proud of the new clothes as any Earth woman would be. The teacher was very proud of her ability to dress up and look like a nurse, and it took me a long time to get over the baggage from Hollywood, because every time you look at a Hollywood movie, aliens are supposed to be weird and different, Yeah, and I really, it took me. It was such a shock to have the teacher walk in with, wearing a new dress that she had bought from Sears and proudly show it off and say, "What do you think of my dress?" Yeah.